Hey guys, I wanted to give my thoughts on the recent patch 13.3, and this is the first patch in a while that has had significant changes to support. Patches in the recent past have been directed to other roles, and then supports typically want to adapt to what are happening to the other roles and to the meta. But here we're getting some direct changes, and so there are some pretty relevant changes going on, and I wanted to give my thoughts, so let's jump right into it. Now we're going to start with Amumu, and I think this was mainly targeted towards jungle Amumu, but these are relevant nerfs to support Amumu. So having a higher mana cost on his Q, and of course you're going to be throwing that out a couple of times in an all-in. This is going to be relevant. Now he's still going to be strong. I don't think this is going to make him go too much. He's not going to be constantly spamming out Qs in the laning phase. It's just like a little bit of a nerf. Almost a placebo nerf, to be honest, but for his E, now this is a really big one. 15 damage off of E level 1. This is probably going to be most noticeable for jungle Amumu, but we're going to keep this patch rundown for supports. And what this does in my eyes is encourage E max. And so what you could do beforehand is either Q max or E max. More points into E is, I think it was a little bit underused, and especially with those ADCs, double ADCs running around, giving that damage reduction to physical damage. His E could make him really, really tanky. And typically in an all-in, you're getting out a couple of Qs anyway. The recharge time going down doesn't really affect what he wants to do. Now I'm probably going to be considering going E-max, and the reason is by 3 points in E, you're only missing out on 5 damage. So this is like a little bit annoying, and I don't think Amumu support was overwhelming in any sense. This just comes as a surprise to me. Okay, moving on to Annie, and now again, Riot's intention, I think, is to buff Annie mid, and the reason is because they're giving so many AP ratio buffs, and typically supports are going to struggle to stack AP, unlike a solo lane Annie. But then they just give huge flat number buffs to her spells, and that's going to work out for support, because support has less access to gold and to experience, so anything in terms of the early game stats is going to go a long way. And so the shield gets significantly stronger, and the cooldown gets significantly shorter. The initial flat damage off of her E also gets buffed, and it's a lot easier to proc the damage from the Molten Shield. And so the first things that come to mind for this, they're pretty much going to be two paths we can take here. We can either go the damage Annie support, where your new spammable E could proc Rylays and could proc Liandry's effectively, or you go a more utility-oriented build with potentially Moonstone. And so I want to talk about these two paths, because I do think that this is a significant buff to Annie's E. It is becoming incredibly spammable and strong. And of course, Tibber's getting tankier. That's not only going to help for mid lane. Tibber's proccing Rylays and Liandry's, or Tibber's proccing Moonstone constantly. That's always going to be a big plus. And so if you're an OG of League, then you would know that Annie used to be play support many, many, many years ago, in the very early days of competitive League. And the reason for that is because she had that reliable setup with Flash Tibbers or even Flash W to set up a skirmish. But she also had really high range. She has 625 auto attack range, and that is one of the highest attack ranges in the game. I believe Caitlyn maybe 650, Ashe maybe 600. And so this can make her incredibly obnoxious in the laning phase. And it is very important at the moment to be able to get some bot prio, to be able to stack neutrals. I did mention how oppressive stacking neutrals is in my what is happening with the bot lane meta right now video. I'm going to link that below. But Annie can quite handily tie into that early bot prio and harass a lot. But anyway, let's talk about the two main build paths that we could consider for Annie, or at least what I want to test. And the first one is going to be for AP Annie, and so it'll most likely be one of these. Comet might do a little bit more damage in terms of poking out the enemy, especially if it's a range versus range matchup. It's going to scale worse. Aerie is going to provide more throughout the game, just being able to shield teammates and proccing off of Tibbers who is more tanky and going to be applying damage consistently. And then we'd probably want to go Mana Flow. Now, the thing about Annie support is that she doesn't get to charge up her passive for free. Everything is going to cost mana. For Annie mid, she can last hit with a Q and get that refund, so there is an argument for Mana Flow. However, Nimbus Cloak is going to be something worth considering as well, so that you can get in range for that Tibber stun. But most of the time, it's probably going to be Mana Flow, and then Transcendence and Scorch. And then for the secondaries, for the damage Annie, we're probably going to have a bunch of options here. If we want to go Red Tree, we could do Taste of Blood Treasure to get our items faster. We could do Taste of Blood Relentless. This is never going to be a bad option. Who wants to get in range to be able to find her stuns. And then Ulti Hunter, maybe. I'm not convinced on running Ulti Hunter, but a lower cooldown on Tibbers could be pretty impactful. We could also consider something like Hex Flash Cosmic and Nimbus, so then when you Hex Flash, you get that Nimbus proc, and you can get in range to ult a little bit faster. And then the last tree that I want to talk about is we could maybe go into the green tree, and go something like Bone Plating Revitalize, especially paired with Airy. We're going to get a little bit more scaling for Revitalize with Airy, and shielding us or our teammates with Revitalize could always go a long way. And so what the damage, build would look like, I would imagine it would be 3 points Q for that lane poke and harass, and then probably max E. It just looks like such a spammable ability at the moment, and we're not going to be locked in lane, spamming Q, getting value out of that. And then the points in W, that's only really going to be applied with a flash anyway, and it's not going to be the most reliable way to use our kit and to get damage out. And then in terms of items, that would probably be Riley's Rush into Liandry's. Riley's is very affordable and it's very easy for Annie to proc that, especially off of the tankier Tibbers and the spammable E of hers. Liandry's going to have a huge amount of uptime, again, with her E and with Tibbers. And then either Sork Shoes or Lucidities. It probably makes the most sense to go Sork Shoes because all of your abilities obviously do have magic damage that get applied. You could make an argument for Lucidities for a higher uptime on Flash and a higher uptime on just having your E up. And then for further items to wrap up the AP scaling build, I guess you can consider Zhonya's or Morello's or Medjai's. But again, these items are so expensive that it's unlikely that you're going to be able to just round out your entire build. And moving on to the build that I think is going to be the best. So this is going to be much of the same. You want to have areas that you can harass in lane, abuse your long auto attack range and your Q and even your E. And then we're going to back it up, probably Bone Plating Revitalize. And the main difference here is going to be the builds. And so this would be E max into a more utility oriented build. Now you can consider, again, 3 points Q and then into the E max just for a little bit more laning power. I do think getting those 5 points at E as quickly as possible with this utility build might be really effective. And then in terms of the build, we'd want to go Moonstone. So it's very easy for Annie to be constantly proccing Moonstone with Tibbers and with her E spam dealing damage. And then Staff of Flowing Water as well, giving herself and her ally additional AP. So she got a bunch of AP scaling buffs, which is really good. She already had really high AP ratios, so that just makes a lot of sense. Also, Moonstone and Staff of Flowing Water both give AP, so they're not even just utility items. And then rounding out that build with Lucidities. And then once you have Moonstone, you have Staff of Flowing Water, you have your Lucidity boots, you have 5 points in E. Your E becomes an incredibly low cooldown, just over 5 seconds. And so the downtime on her E would be only 2 seconds, which is pretty absurd. And so this is just purely theoretical at the moment. I haven't tried it out. The patch has recently come out, but this is something that I do want to try. I do think that it makes sense. She can get early prio. She's going to scale incredibly well with Emax into the utility build. And then rounding out that build, I think you could go Chemtech Putrefier so that you can easily apply Heal Cut for your teammates. And then pretty much any support item that builds out of Forbidden Idol to keep amping up your shielding. So those are the two main build paths that I want to try for any I see being relevant. I am going to add a few more. This is just purely theoretical. I'm in the kitchen, I'm cooking. So what we could do is Rylays with Mandate, and we would have seen this item combination with Azir Mid for a time, I think it was last year. You can slow them with Rylays, you can proc Mandate off of you slowing them, and Mandate is obviously more affordable than Liandry's. We could even pair that up with Font of Life so that when they do get slowed, then you can heal your teammates. And then I initially did consider going like a Guardian tree with the utility Emax Annie. However, I think Aerie is just going to be far too valuable. Same thing with Glacial Augment. Again, you can make an argument for it. I can see finding those stuns into the Glacial could be useful, but I think the Aerie and the Revitalize is just going to work a little bit too well together for Annie. Last page I'm going to talk about is Predator for Annie so that she can get into range to find those stuns. However, I don't think we're taking advantage of the buffs that she got, especially to her E. I probably should have mentioned this at the start of talking about Annie, but when she spawns with her passive fully charged, this is amazing that you can just Q start, show up in bot lane, and immediately find a stun. You have a lot of threat that could potentially allow you to get level 2 in more matchups. So I'm very excited to give Annie a shot, and I think you guys should try her out too. Moving on, so again, this is not supports tailored. They did Amumu, they did Annie, and now they're doing Jarvan, but these are all champions that are viable as supports. I play a lot of Jarvan support on my Smurf and on my main as well. And like I said, any flat values are amazing for support. And so base armor up by 2, that's going to be relevant. And flat cooldown reduction, that's going to be relevant as well. And then the shield strength scaling with bonus 80, that's not going to be relevant. These numbers just aren't really going to impact when you would choose Jarvan or not. I think he is a great compositional counterpick when they show a bunch of the mobile carries and you can just lock them down and provide, an arena for your teammates to just follow up and blow them up. Okay, the next relevant change for support is Radiant Virtue. And now, On my preseason video, I did talk about Radiant Virtue. I breezed over it way too much. I thought it was going to be too expensive, and the affordability of Even Shroud and of Locket I thought was just way too important for support. But it actually was very strong. I started to build Radiant Virtue in situations where I thought the fights would be a little bit more extended. And so I would build Even Shroud on my engagers if the fights are going to be really fast, to just try and one-shot them. And then if it's not going to be really fast and I can provide a bunch of uptime with Radiant Virtue, then I found a lot of value in that item. It especially changed how I looked to use my ult, because I could just use my ult in a somewhat suboptimal situation just to start getting the procs for the cooldown reduction and for the healing for the teammates. Now it's going to be really hard to make that argument. 3,200 is incredibly expensive for a support. And then the 30 extra seconds onto the passive, it's going to be much less spammable. And so I'm quite hesitant to consider this item now. And I envision this item to be mainly tailored towards tanky junglers now. And then Umbral Glaive, so this was running rampant. I talked about this in my what is going on with the bot meta video. So this is definitely a relevant change. However, I think if they really wanted to nerf this item, it needed to go to 60. This is actually quite an intelligent change that they made, so that ranged users can't use it as well as melee users. However, the cooldown is still too short, and revealing these wards and then just having to invest one more order, that's not really a big deal. So a step in the right direction, but I don't think quite enough to take out those ranged supports who are just going to abuse this item, particularly Ashe. I think Ashe is the main issue with ADC supports. I think she just scales far too well with her W and her E and her R and her mandate. And so I think Ashe nerfs would be much more appropriate than Umbral nerfs, because you see a Caitlyn or a Kalista support, sure, they can get some utility out of this, but at the end of the day, they're not really scaling into the mid to late whatsoever. So it's pretty risky to pick those, but anyway, let's move on. Now, this is where it gets really confusing. So they are literally saying here that they want to make changes to melee supports to spice up the bot lane meta. But then what they do is they add a bunch of AP scaling onto melee supports, which just makes absolutely no sense. And so we'll get into them one by one. So let's start with Alistar. And so these end up being a buff to his passive. So that's nice, that's relevant, right? From level 1, he's going to be healing more mana cost buffs for his combo. So this is great. This is awesome for Ellie in the early game, being able to be more free with comboing in and doing the two-step process, chunking them out, disengaging, and then re-engaging and looking for the kill. But then we notice that he has a bunch of AP ratios added onto him, and he has level 5 E mana cost buffs, which just really doesn't make any sense at all. He's going to be maxing E last. He's never going to be level 18 in a game. And in what world Alistar is going to be stacking AP? So they were buffing melee supports to create variety in bot lane, and then they're buffing AP ratios. And so with your Relic Shield, you're going to be doing like 5-10 more damage on a combo. Who cares? So this is just a little bit of a question mark. Now, I do think that there are relevant buffs, his passive, his combo mana cost, but I still don't think this is quite enough. I'd still much rather pick Rakan or Rel. I think Alistar lacks a cohesive identity. He is weak early, and then he doesn't really scale that well into teamfights. Rakan is weak early, much more mobile, much harder to lock down, and fantastic at playing off of mobile allies and scaling into the mid to late, being that engage tool. Rel, fantastic at disengaging and engaging. And then Alistar is just kind of left in the dust. I mean, he has like a point and click lockdown, but it can still be dash and it's not the longest range. So they need to do a little bit more systematic reworks for Alistar. And now let's move on to Braum. And so there are a bunch of changes to Braum, but at the end of the day, Braum is used as a counterpick to engage two low range comps. And so unless they just absolutely overwhelm his kit with ridiculous numbers, I don't expect to ever see him get blind picked. And that's how it should be, right? There should be champion classes that counter certain compositions and can't be picked every time. And so we can just have a look at the numbers here. So the only relevant thing for this one is it gets a couple seconds lower on his passive at level 6 rather than level 7. Okay, I mean, I don't really see getting 2 stuns off in a fight at level 6 or level 7 anyway. That would have to be a really long, really extended fight, but you know, it's nice. The Q, the 2 seconds lower at level 1. So this is amazing. And this is how you should buff melee supports, right? You target the flat numbers early on in the game. So 2 seconds off his Q, it's a lot more spammable. Now, honestly, I think Braum's Q should be much more spammable than it is. I think it costs too much mana, but maybe they didn't want to overbuff Braum. That's fine. And then the resistance buff on W, this is insane. And so now I would honestly consider 3 points Q into W max or 3 points Q into E max, because the cooldown just kind of gets flattened out anyway, and it's not a buff when it is maxed out. And these resistances are just quite insane, to be honest. A lot of flat values here. And so I was going to be picking Braum to counter melees and engagers and short range comps anyway, but this is just more of an incentive to do so. Now let's move on to Nautilus. And again, these are relevant changes, but the numbers are just quite small. So 6 damage on his passive. So Nautilus loves to be a lane bully and find windows to kill 2v2. And having early stats and more damage on his initial combo, like hook, auto, and then W auto with the auto attack reset. So having more damage here, that's nice, but 6 damage, obviously it's not really going to make much of a difference at all. And then a more spammable W, this is awesome. 20 less mana cost and a stronger shield, that's definitely going to be relevant. I'm not really sure why they felt the need to do this. I honestly think Nautilus is in a pretty good spot, and he's the engager that I'm most commonly blind picking on my main. Again, this is high elo, this is on my challenger account, and so maybe in lower elos, Nautilus doesn't have as much success. Small but relevant changes for Nautilus support, and then they just add on a random buff to AP scaling jungle Nautilus or something. I really don't know what they're trying to do. They say one thing, then they buff other instances of their champions, but whatever. Moving on, and so I was excited for the Pyke changes, because they had 2 changes initially. They had 40 extra base damage, or it was a 0.4 AD ratio on his Q, whatever. It was a really big deal. And then they removed that. And so this is going to be relevant, to be honest. You do want to max E second, and in the mid to late game, if you can get that extra damage, then you might be able to find that execute range. But this is going to be really late in the game. It should be pretty much decided, the outcome of the game, by the time you have 5 points in E. And so this is pretty much nothing. Now Rakan, this is strange. So they buff his Q, great. It's more spammable. It has a lower cooldown. It heals a bit more. And then they nerf his W damage scaling. So again, I don't know what they're trying to do. You're not really incentivized to max Q, right? Because the mana cost is a flat value. Sure, the cooldown goes down by 1, but the heal amount is based on your level, not on the points in your Q. So you don't want to really put many points into Q, and then you are punished for putting points into your W. And this is really relevant, to be honest. In my Rakan guide, I talked about how important every single point of his W is in finding more damage to be able to have that threat. And now they're taken away from that threat. And so the most relevant point would be at level 5 with 3 points in your W. So 10, it's not the biggest, but it is going to hurt. And again, they're just adding random AP scaling ratios. And so Rakan is going to have access to AP with his Spell Thieves, with Shurelias. And so at the end of the day, this is going to be pretty much the same in terms of damage. But again, it doesn't quite make logical sense to me what type of changes they are looking for. However, the extra sustain on Q is going to be amazing, because Rakan is really weak early, and now he gets an easier time to be able to keep themselves sustained in the lane. And so I might start blind picking Rakan a lot more often. Okay, moving on to Thresh, and so they are buffing his AP ratio, and so this is going to scale off of his souls, because his souls give him AP. But again, this is going to be mid to late game, and we need early numbers and stats for our supports. So those AP ratios for Alistar, that's going to favor him being in a solo lane. The AP ratio for Rakan's W, solo lane. The AP ratios for Thresh here, solo lane. Like, I'm going to stop complaining, but they say they want to mix up the bot lane meta. It just makes absolutely no sense. But anyway, let's keep going. This isn't really relevant. You're not going to get the full value out of your W. Normally, you're just going to use it to give your teammates mobility, and so cooldown reduction on W would be a much bigger deal than shield per soul. This is a nerf anyway, but it's not going to be that relevant. And then they took out their proposed changes of reducing his flag cooldown, and now this is, in my opinion, the main reason that Thresh has fallen out of the meta. He used to be picked into Nautilus, into Leona, because of his E being able to disengage. However, they then nerfed its cooldown, and so then it had less uptime. And they were going to add a second back onto it, and they removed that, and so now it's just a bunch more AP scaling. Honestly, completely irrelevant changes here, which is pretty unfortunate. I think having that 1 extra second cooldown reduction on the E was a good idea. They were suggesting it. I think it was in their PBE for this patch. So the tenacity changes, this isn't really going to be relevant for anything. It's just harder to get a high amount of tenacity. That's not really going to change our decisions too much. So we kind of got baited by Riot. They said they're going to mix up the bot lane meta, and then they just made irrelevant changes. It feels like they don't really understand their game. I don't know how some of these changes go through and are approved by everyone. But anyway, let's wrap this up with a bit of a summary on what we should keep an eye on for 13.3. Annie is the biggest one in my mind. We're definitely going to have to play around with her. Braum, as a counter to engagers and to low range comps, is definitely worth considering adding to your pool now. And the extra sustain on Rakan early game is going to go a long way. I'm going to hold out hope for Riot to still make some systematic, impactful changes to support. These were kind of number-oriented for a bunch of champs. If they adjusted support items, and I know that this is a proposed change for the next patch, they're going to be adjusting Spell Thieves or Relic Shield potentially. That's going to be exciting to theorycraft about. If they change the pace of game, so maybe they buffed or nerfed neutrals. Honestly, they should nerf neutrals at the moment to allow more diversity and more creativity coming out of the support role. At the moment, the games feel very fast-paced and you have to be able to keep up with the pace of game. Or if they added, XP changes to support and then we don't have to be so locked into early game values. A man can dream. Maybe one day they will make some interesting changes to spark some creativity. For now, we're going to get our creativity fixed by having to play around with Annie. Anyway, I hope you found this video interesting or helpful, and please let me know down below what you are going to try out and your thoughts on these changes. Thanks for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed. Big thank you to all of my Patreons over here. I really couldn't do this without you. The links for coaching, for Patreon, for my School of Support Discord server, for socials, they're all going to be linked in the description below. Any and all support is greatly appreciated. I am streaming 5 days a week now at twitch.tv/cupcakeoce. Come say hi, I would love to see you there.